tenders, where they're not going to women-owned and led SMEs. And we thought it was as simple as that. Yeah, we talk to companies and they're going to allocate, and then we're going to do a call for participants, and women will come and they'll bid for those contracts. But believe you me, it's more complex than that, and that is what we've learned over the last 4 years. So we started with a very quick market assessment, and we just wanted to know what is happening across the demand and supply. So we went out and we spoke to over 500 SMEs, both women-owned and male-owned, and we found that just 3% of the procurement business with the sample that we worked with was going to women-owned SMEs, and the rest was shared, with the male counterparts. We also looked at what was happening with the buyers, with the corporates, and we learned a few things. These companies are concerned about, one, cost. That guy in procurement is there to save the company money, so that's his number one priority. Two, he's thinking about risk. What's the risk with this, with my suppliers? Whom do I choose over the other? Who's going to deliver, faster and more efficiently? Three, they're also thinking about quality. So they want to come to your business and see how you're dealing with your EHS issues, how you are treating your employees, the traceability issues that some of you might be aware of. And they're also thinking about, competitiveness in the supply chain. How do I make sure that I have an agile supply chain distribution network that is going to support the business well? Everything else is on the periphery. When we talk about sustainability, gender, ESGs, if you don't show me the business case, they're not going to invest in reaching out, in market development, and in onboarding women-owned SMEs. So one of the main objectives, therefore, for us was to really raise awareness and quantify the business case as to why corporates need to think about reaching out to women-owned SMEs and onboarding them into their supply chains. Then we went out to the ecosystem and we worked with a number of partners, including KEPSA, WeConnect, looking at how can we get more women-owned SMEs that are ready to do business with the private sector. And we learned a few things there. Number one was capacity, operational capacity. And Mary put it here very, very clearly. If you're the only one cooking your makeup, how much of it are you going to cook in a day, in a week, in a month? So you need to be able to have that operational capacity to be able to fill a stand at Naivas with your makeup and your beauty products. So think about operational capacity. Number two, we learned that finance was also a very big deal. And I'll just show you some shocking statistics, that a lot of women-owned businesses, when we think about financing our business, we go for very expensive loans. Well, there are other options, much cheaper solutions in the market. We also learned, and this was the biggest game changer, and Mary is here, Mary Thu, connections and access to information. Being able to put name to face and to save that contact in your mobile phone so that when you see the opportunity out there, you actually know someone you can call, or someone who knows someone who knows someone. There's a documentary I watched a couple of weeks ago on Netflix, and the reason why Trump is trapped today and why he's back again in the White House. And he learned a lot of things from his lawyer. Please go watch it. A lot of things are not very, don't pick everything, just pick the good ones. And one of the things that he learned that to this day he practices is that please don't follow the issue. Give me the information, but tell me the person behind the information. Okay? So when you see the tender and you get, or you see the grant and you get your grant person you've been paying for a year, other people are doing what? They are talking one-on-one, yeah? So the access to information and the matchmaking networking events that we had with the corporates and the women-owned SMEs are really the ones that brought those over 400 contracts that I talked about. Just moving on swiftly. So we thought about the demand and the supply side. So we looked at what do corporates need for them to be able to work on this and to invest. Because remember, for them to work on inclusive supply chains, they actually need a a couple of people that are pushing the agenda internally. They need a management that is prioritizing this and making it a strategic agenda for the business. But they also need to be able to come out here and do market development and build a strong pipeline of women-owned SMEs. So we brought 10 of the corporates, 8 of them extremely active, and they set targets. They said over the next 3 years, we are going to increase the share of our purchasing budgets and contracts to women-owned SMEs by X percent. And where we came in is to tell them, okay, you won't get to X percent if you don't do X, Y, Z. And it was really very basic things to start with, like where are the women in your procurement operation? Like where do they sit? What services or goods are they supplying? And we were supporting them for them first and foremost to have that visibility, and then to come out to the market and connect with the likes of WeConnect, KEPSA, and yourselves to start building that pipeline of the women that they can actually source from. We also reached about 1,200 women entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses, with very intense procurement readiness trainings that were tailored towards private sector procurement, as well as specific ones. For example, what does Bamburi need to be able to source from you if you're in construction, if you're in infrastructure space? So we had those one-on-one trainings with the companies, and the women were able to know, okay, this is what I need to do to my business for me able to be successful in working with any of those companies that we work with. We also thought about access to finance, and I'll talk a bit about that, but sadly, we did not deep dive into that because for finance to work, there has to be money. But for the banks that we work with, we had 2 banks, and I can see Absa in the room today, so well done, Absa. We also had Stanbic that were working on the procurement, on the contracts piece, but we also had other banks that joined us along the way, Equity Bank, we have Citibank, we have Standard Chartered, that were looking at you all as a formidable market. They wanted to lend you and they wanted to grow. But we also learned for them to be able to think about supply chain finance solutions, not just any other credit lines that you advance to business. You have to be able to show a strong pipeline. If a bank is going to raise capital specifically for supply chain finance for women-owned businesses, they need to be assured that there is a very strong pipeline, but that there are also corporates that they want to work with who actually forward these women-owned SMEs for supply chain financing. So when you look at the whole ecosystem, everything has to work in tandem, right? So the corporates, number one, have to allocate the contracts. The women-owned SMEs have to be ready to win and service those contracts. And the banks have to have the capital to be able to finance those women-owned SMEs. So it can't be about corporate allocating more contracts to women-owned SMEs and the story ends there. And that's why the next phase of our Sourcing to Equal program is going to be anchored on access to finance, with more banks that are coming on board that are going to build solutions for supply chain financing. The most important story, and this is where we also need to kind of flip the project and put it back on its feet, is the impact of this work on the economy. I know the director from the ministry has mentioned that the private sector contributes 80% of our GDP. But when you think about how much of that women contribute, there's a very clear missed opportunity. We had a very small sample, 1,100 women-owned enterprises that we worked with. We had 10 corporates. But out of those that accessed the contracts you see on the board there, 88% of those businesses grew their revenues by an average of 28% over 3 years. And we know we're talking about a lot about creating jobs in new sectors, in new industries, but we're forgetting the power of women-owned businesses in that space. 73% of those businesses that were doing new business with corporates were able to create an average of 5 jobs per enterprise. That means they were adding or creating 5 new jobs and had 5 more employees over the course of those 3 years. Now, focusing a bit on the access to finance, and when we think about how then do you become more efficient in the way you run your business? How do you access the right kind of financing? Because if you get a contract, then you walk in and get any other credit line that is super expensive, you need collateral, etc. That is just going to eat into your margin. But there are other solutions to supply chain financing that actually enable you to access. A lot of you have done this funding upfront, but also at a much discounted rate because they take the risk on the buyer, for example. And that's what we are looking to develop going forward. And we found that only 9% of the women that we worked with were accessing the actual kind of financing you need to service private sector suppliers. So that is very, very tiny in the context of what is happening. We have a couple of banks that are doing supply chain financing, and what we found out is that a lot of those SMEs that are able to benefit from those platforms are male-owned SMEs, and that is because a lot of these programs focus on tier one suppliers. And a lot of those tier one suppliers are the big suppliers. They've grown over the years with those companies, and there are too few women at that space. The most of women-owned businesses are actually suppliers of suppliers of suppliers. So they're seated way deep into the supply chain that they're not able to access this type of financing. So we also have to have conversations with the banks and think about deep tier financing. How can supply chain go deep tier where the women are actually operating, but also expanding the traditional, supply chain financing solutions like, factoring, where banks can actually confidently buy those invoices and be able to finance. But for banks to be able to do that, they need to raise capital that is inexpensive, but also enables them to make money. And that is where DFIs like IFCs of this world come in and enable banks to be able to go that extra mile. So that is going to be the next phase of our program. And we are very deeply grateful to all our partners that we work with. First and foremost, to the 10 companies that took that leap of faith. It involved a lot of investing. We know companies that hired people during the course of those 4 years to just focus on inclusive supply chains. Companies that went out and signed up to WEBs, for instance, to be able to expand inclusive and sustainable supply chains. And they are the ones that have enabled us to showcase what is possible. They have managed to reach out to the banks, and the banks now look at you in this room, and I'm sure they just see loans. So we are very, very grateful. But most importantly, we also had other ecosystem partners, because we couldn't do that without the likes of WeConnect, KEPSA, CAM, Chamber of Commerce, OWIT, and all of those that came together and helped us to really convene and be able to connect the ecosystem. So we look forward to working on this together. My colleague Patricia is here. She can talk a little bit more about the access to finance piece, because that is really the missing part that we need to work on. If you're able to grow from 500 and quadruple that to 10, 40, 100 companies and see more business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Another round of applause. So as you can see, IFC is walking the talk. And of course, we are working together with like-minded partners such as KEPSA and other corporates, as you've seen, to make sure that we make the ambition of making affordable and accessible capital to women's SMEs a reality, as well as